delighted to see so many of you have signed up for this third webinar in our AI Impact Series. And today's webinar is EU AI Act. And it's my great pleasure to welcome our keynote speakers today, Brian Connolly, who's Director responsible for responsible AI, regulatory and compliance, and the European lead on that in Accenture, and Noelle Doody, who's Managing Director, Ireland, Data and AI in Accenture. So thank you very much to both of you for being with us today. We appreciate it very much indeed. I'd just like to say a little bit about BlockW. As Megan has said, it's a female-led, not-for-profit organisation whose mission is to create awareness and increase access to emerging technologies like AI for women and girls. And we do this through advocacy, strategic partnerships and collaborations, and building research and resources to women and girls, and indeed a diverse public. But our key focus is to empower women and girls in this digital age. Today's webinar, as we said, is about the EU AI Act. And that may sound very abstract, but it's not really, because I think both our speakers are going to emphasize we can empower ourselves as individuals and organizations in the context of the AI Act, which to many of us, as I said, appears very abstract. Today's webinar, in many ways, is about empowering all of us in this AI age or decade. The Act really puts the individual in the driving seat. It's all about responsible AI and how we can be involved in setting the agenda in our organizations. We're really lucky to have two really experienced speakers today, very distinguished, Brian Connolly and Noelle Doody, all experts in this area, and work directly with clients in a number of areas, which includes financial services. Both Noelle and Brian introduced the responsible AI. What does it mean and how it affects all of us in our particular situations? They will also give us an overview of the AI Act. Noelle and Brian will explore specific financial services use cases and will look at the AI aspects of other regulatory frameworks and will discuss key dimensions to be included in the authorization of the Act. Finally, they will focus on organizations in financial services, particularly implementing responsible AI frameworks. They will include some real-world examples of specific challenges and ideas how they can be overcome. But I think what's really important, they will leave us with a set of key recommendations as a framework for the implementation of the EU AI Act in our own work situations. Noelle and Brian will speak to us for 40 to 45 minutes. And they would love for you to ask questions if you want to during their presentation. If not, wait till the end. We'll be happy to answer questions there. And you can answer them through the QA function at the bottom of your screen. And as Megan has said, this is recorded and will be available from the IOB Digital Library. So Brian and Noelle, we look forward to your presentation. And thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Joyce, and thank you very much for the invitation to attend. We're really delighted to be here today. I think we've been quite comprehensively introduced, which is really great, so thank you again. So what I might do is just very quickly run through the key points which Brian and I would like to discuss today, and the order in which we'll do it. So first of all, we just wanted to, I guess, kind of talk at a high level about AI and also about some of the key dimensions of responsible AI, as you mentioned. Then I know Brian will go into a bit more detail on the EU AI Act specifically and the implications of that. And then finally, as you mentioned, we have some real life world examples of how responsible AI is being embedded in the development of AI applications, which hopefully will bring to life, kind of how this can be done and embedded, and kind of almost responsible AI by design. So I guess kind of the first point to make is that although analytics and applied artificial intelligence has been around, for quite a long time, the recent rise of kind of many customer-facing tools such as ChatGPT have really kind of allowed AI, and in particular generative AI, to come to the fore. So, for example, just to give a sense of the numbers, ChatGPT reached 1 million monthly users globally within 2 months of its launch, making it one of the most successful, if not successful, the most successful, kind of customer-facing applications in history. But this kind of, I suppose, kind of huge, kind of success has led to kind of a very much a heightened awareness for consumers of AI, and I guess both of the opportunities of AI, but also the risks associated with it. And, from an Accenture perspective, how we're seeing this kind of increased awareness and increased interest manifest itself quite often, one of the ways we see it is we have, kind of a large amount of interest in, we have a generative AI studio in our research centre in the Dock in Dublin. And we have a large amount of requests for, kind of workshops in the Dock around this topic. And very often, kind of the 3 main topics or questions that a lot of the workshop attendees and organizations and clients have is, first of all, they want to ask, where is the value to employing these types of technologies? But then very quickly, people are asking, well, what does it mean for my people? What impact would that have on them? And then thirdly, again, very quickly after that, the next question then is, how do I do this responsibly and safely? And I suppose if we focus on, that third question, it's worth noting that, our research is showing that nearly half of executives feel that they lack the full confidence in the risk management process to manage enterprise-wide integration of technologies like AI and generative AI. And I guess when you couple that with, again, what our research is showing, that whilst a lot of companies may have started to think about their responsible AI frameworks, etc., only about 2% of companies have this fully embedded into their systems and operations. So, when you see numbers and statistics like that from the research, it's quite easy to see why a lot of organizations want to speak to people like my colleague Brian. And then just if we think about, I guess, kind of the risks that some of the executives are concerned about, no doubt some people on the call, or many people on the call, we'd be familiar with some of these types of, I guess, risks associated with AI, whether it's to do with kind of bias and potentially kind of, kind of unfairness, the accuracy or in some cases inaccuracy of outputs, concerns around sustainability, kind of liability and, say, for example, IP concerns, and then also around kind of, data confidentiality, data security. And then finally, as I mentioned, that second question that people often ask, what does this mean for my people and how will it affect my organization? And I suppose one of the interesting things that I was thinking about when I was looking at these risks again was that quite often companies or organizations say, well, if they're approaching AI, if they say, well, I'm going to reduce my risk because I'm going to focus on an internal application first. And whilst absolutely from a risk of, I guess, kind of external reputational risk, if you focus on an internal application first, that very much kind of mitigates or helps reduce that risk. But many of these risks, say, for example, like, inaccuracy or, impact on workers, or say, for example, IP concerns, they are equally, valid, whether it's an internal application or an external application. So it just, again, kind of reinforces the need for responsible AI if you want to, kind of harness the power of these new technologies. So I'll pass over to Brian now to just talk a little bit more about responsible AI in general, and then also to talk about the EU AI Act.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much, Noelle. So yeah, I mean, as Noelle has said, I mean, we consider responsible AI to be absolutely integral to AI in general. I mean, we're all aware clearly of the huge potential AI has. I mean, I think everyone remembers November 2022 when ChatGPT came out and it exploded onto the scene, and it was probably a tipping point in the public perception of AI. I mean, AI has been around for a long time, but that was, as I say, a tipping point. And since then, it has only increased and accelerated. But there's a general acknowledgement, I think, globally that, you know, with the potential comes risk. And our view is that looking at the risk and managing it, trying to minimize it and managing and mitigating it is absolutely critical. It allows you to create value. It allows you to build trust, because I think trust is absolutely critical. Whether you're talking about trust among your own workforce, trust among your customers, trust among society in general, I think it's absolutely critical that an organization that's using AI or creating AI is able to generate that trust. And as I say, the risks are substantial, as Noelle has pointed out already. And our view is, as AI, I suppose, becomes more embedded into, you know, organizations, society, etc., those risks would probably increase and be amplified as well. So it's very, very important to deal with them. It's very important to look at the responsible, the ethical, the compliance side of AI at the same time as you're looking at the technological side, the operational side, and so on, because it's much easier to bake it in at the beginning than try to, I suppose, retrofit it at a later point. So it's around the value, optimizing that value. It's around developing and improving trust, and it's around trying to de-risk, or at the very least manage risk of AI. So if you move on, Noelle, what the EU has tried to do is regulate in this area. So if you just go back, Noelle, one sec, I'll stick with the introduction just for a moment, if that's okay. As I said, I think globally there's a recognition that, you know, this is an area that needs to be regulated. The problem, as ever, for legislators and regulators is that technology gallops ahead. It always has, it always will, just given the speed and innovation and so on, and the regulators follow. So around the world, there have been varying attempts to regulate AI. You probably have a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have the EU, which has regulated this by way of binding, mandatory, directly applicable legislation, and we will talk about that in a couple of minutes. On the other end, you have countries like the US, where basically there are voluntary guidelines, voluntary codes, and so on. They are trying to implement legislation, but I suppose given the political sort of environment in the US at the moment, that's proving very difficult, certainly at a federal level. So there was a US executive order which came out, but that, I suppose, is quite high level, isn't binding, and so on. Individual states are doing things. Most recently, Colorado is always quoted as an example of something quite similar to the EU. But the US is sort of going the voluntary way. The EU is at the other extreme, and then you've countries along the middle adopting a different approach. I think in Europe, the way they're dealing with the regulation of AI is in the context of, I suppose, broader, what they call digital transformation. And there's this constant focus on innovation versus regulation and striking that balance. And I think you may have seen there within the last week, Mario Draghi, the former ECB president, basically came out with a big report on European competitiveness. And there's a concern that perhaps the EU has over-regulated. I think, again, I saw a full-page letter printed. I think it was sponsored by Meta and a group of other tech companies, talking about how perhaps the EU has over-regulated in this area. So there's always going to be that balance, I suppose. But what the EU is trying to do, it's trying to come up with this regulation in the context of digital transformation. It's trying to promote the development and use of trustworthy AI systems. And it has come up with what it claims is the first comprehensive AI law in the world. So this is a very significant development. This has happened before. The EU came up with very important data protection legislation. You may remember the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, back in 2018. That had extraterritorial effect, which I'll come on to in a minute, and the AI Act also has extraterritorial effect. But a side effect of the EU AI Act is that it may end up having the Brussels effect. So you may have heard of this expression, which is whereby it's to regulate EU primarily. It has extraterritorial effect, but countries around the world basically say, okay, look, if we want to do business in a market the size of the EU, we have to meet that regulation. Let's just use that perhaps as our standard in our country as well, so we have a more consistent, standardized approach. That happened to a greater or lesser extent with GDPR, and it's not that it's the primary focus of the EU, but it may well be an after effect of it. The Act itself took years to develop. I mean, it was at least 3 or 4 years in the making. There was a huge amount of discussion, there was debate, there was a huge amount of lobbying, and I might point out a couple of those. So, you know, obviously various industries had particular interests, legitimate interests and legitimate concerns about aspects of it. So there was a huge amount of lobbying. There was compromise, as with a lot of EU legislation. A lot of compromise goes into it when you have 27 member states coming together trying to thrash out something that's going to be binding. There's always going to be compromise, and there was even a little bit of controversy, I think. But we're at the stage now where the Act has come in. And if you want to just move on, Noelle, to the next slide, thank you. So before we jump into the detail of the Act, and I'll do that on the following slide, but just to give you maybe 6 key takeaways about the Act before we get into the detail. The first thing to say is it's a piece of legislation, so it's actually binding. It's binding and it's mandatory, and it's going to take effect directly in the laws of each of the EU member states. You can contrast it with the directive, which is something that comes out. Member states have 2 years to implement, and they need to pass local legislation, and that local legislation can be, you know, can vary, can differ from member state to member state. The EU AI Act has come in. It's going to be exactly the same in all of the 27 member states. So the view is that that will allow for consistency, standard approaches, etc., around the EU. It's not to say that member states may not supplement the EU AI Act in their own country, but they're not allowed, if you like, dilute it or water it down or go for a lower standard. So I think that's the first important point. Second thing to say is it's a horizontal piece of legislation. So that means it's not specific to any industry. It's not specific to a function. It covers all industries, all use cases. It's going to cover all types of AI systems and all types of AI models. So it's across the board. It's cross industry, unlike other industry specific legislation. Interestingly, it's modeled to a large extent on products liability legislation. So the approach the EU has taken is they treat AI like a product. They treat it like software. They treat it like a product, and therefore there's a number of concepts in the EU AI Act which basically reflect that product basis, if you like. So there's talk about meeting harmonized standards. There's talk about applying for and obtaining a conformity assessment, having a CE mark, and so on. Post-market monitoring. There are local market surveillance authorities that are authorized to basically check out and maintain supervision over particular AI systems on an ongoing basis. It's risk-based again, and this is where the EU basically feels it's helping promote European values and so on. And the way the EU has addressed the Act is basically it looks at a particular AI system or an AI model, and it basically says, what is the level of risk that this poses to the fundamental rights of an individual or to the health and safety of an individual? And the greater the level of risk that it poses, then the greater the obligations that are going to apply to that AI system and that are going to apply to both the provider and the deployer of that AI system. Sorry, just one second. So as I say, it's risk-based, it's extraterritorial, and this is something that is exercising, you know, particularly the US, but a lot of countries as well. So you may be creating an AI system anywhere in the world, but you come within the Act if that system is placed on the market in the EU, if it's sold in the EU. If you're using it in the EU, you're covered by the Act. And also, if the outputs of that AI system are used in the EU, you're going to be covered by the Act. So it is very, very broad extraterritorial effect. And having said that, so there are 2 categories that are mainly under the EU AI Act. The first is providers, and they're the people who actually develop and create the AI. And we all know, obviously, the OpenAI, Google, Meta, et cetera, all those big organizations, ChatGPT and so on. But then also, and they have the majority of obligations under the Act, because they're the ones that are basically creating the AI and the views that they should be baking into the AI during development, the safeguards and risk management approaches that the EU wants them to. Then secondly, you have the deployers, as they call them, which are basically the users. Not so many obligations, but there are some obligations on users, and I look at those in a moment. And then finally, and luckily, there is an acknowledgement that this is going to take some time to implement. Companies may already have AI systems in use. They may be, developing AI systems, deploying them. They may be in development stage, in production stage. So this is going to apply on a staggered basis, and I'll touch on that in a moment. Finally, and thankfully, the Act, as I said, because it's the product of, I suppose, negotiation, lobbying, compromise, in some areas it's extremely detailed, in other areas it's quite vague. So, there isn't a huge amount to go on in some areas. But what the EU Commission has said is they're going to create guidance, they're going to create codes of practice, they're going to have harmonized standards. So again, back to this idea of a product. And they're going to be rolled out in advance of the coming into effect of the various sections of the legislation. So the idea is that, okay, these may be quite rigorous obligations, but we're going to give you guidance about what you should and should not be doing on a practical level. So that will help you implement. Now, as I say, this is going to take some time for organizations to get their heads around and to prepare for. So the hope is that this guidance comes out in good time so that organizations will be able to do that, but we will see. I mean, there's a lot of work still to be done. So that's really a bit of, I suppose, context and scene setting and background for the EU AI Act. So I might just move on, Noelle, to the slide, the next one. There's a lot of detail in this slide, so please excuse me. I was trying to probably synthesize the main sections of the Act into one slide. So it is very busy, but let me guide you through it. I'll take it through it at sort of a high level. And then what we'll do is we'll give some examples of what we mean. So I'll give you some sort of use case examples that are sort of relevant to the financial services sector. And then Noelle will be able to speak specifically about, actual use cases that we've been involved in. So as I said, on the left-hand side, if you look there, this is going to come in on a staggered basis. It basically came into force in August. The most serious provisions, I suppose, are around prohibited AI systems, and I'll talk about those in a moment. They come in next February. There's also actually an important point. From next February, organizations are meant to make sure that their staff that are using AI have a sufficient level of AI literacy, which is what they're calling it. So depending on what level of exposure you're having to AI, you're expected to be provided with training and comms and so on to allow you to use it in a way that allows for compliant use and responsible use and so on. So that's something that organizations should certainly be looking at. The majority, though, of the obligations come in 2 years' time, so August 2026, which is good. So it does give organizations time to get their heads around this. And then particular products, so things like medical devices, equipment, and so on. If they incorporate AI, they need to comply with the Act in 3 years' time. So it is staggered, which is nice. And as I say, hopefully the EU will be able to give us guidance, practical guidance in advance of those deadlines. So then maybe turning to the various levels of risk. And as I said, this is an example of how the EU takes a risk-based approach. There are certain AI system uses which are banned outright. You cannot use them from next February. And I've just given a few examples there. There's a lot around things like predictive policing. So if you're using AI to help, identify suspects and so on, again, back to the point about the fundamental rights of individuals, that's deemed to be an unacceptable level of risk if you're allowing AI systems make decisions around things like, guilt and innocence, and targeting suspects and so on. There's also an acknowledgement that AI is extremely powerful when it comes to influencing individuals and perhaps influencing them subliminally, in terms of recommendations around advertising or whatever it might be. So if AI is used for exploitative or manipulative uses in a way that distorts someone's decision making, so they make decisions that aren't necessarily in their best interest, and that's the way the Act describes it. So that's an example of what's delightfully vague. What exactly is that meant to include? But that is going to be banned. And then there's a lot of detail around metrics. So this is the idea of people's personal data that that shows their physical characteristics like photos of them or their fingerprints or things like that. If they're going to be used in certain circumstances, one example is emotion recognition systems in the workplace and in education. If an organization wants basically to be recognizing and monitoring emotions of individuals in the workplace, that's going to be banned because that's based on biometric data. And again, it's felt that that is just too much of an intrusion on individual human rights. High risk is the next category. This is what the Act concentrates on mainly. The view is that this will affect sort of 10 to 15% of AI systems out there. So while a huge amount of focus on it and there is some rigor and some obligations, the majority of AI systems will probably not fall into prohibited or high risk. So I think just be conscious of that as I go through some of the obligations and what that means. I mean, most of your AI systems that you will be using would probably not fall into this category. But you'll see there now I've listed some of the examples. So again, identification of individuals using biometric. There's a key one around access to essential private and public services and benefits. So again, this is things like access to healthcare and so on. But interestingly, there are two examples which are very relevant to the financial services sector. One is around establishing creditworthiness and one is around risk assessment in the insurance area. And I'll touch on those in a minute again, but they are called out specifically as being of high risk. Law enforcement, as I mentioned, if it's not a banned use, it could be high risk because again, that can have an effect on an individual's freedom, liberty, and so on. And then there are other sort of public service areas like migration, border control, administration of justice, and so on, where there's a huge focus on AI and it being used in a fair way. And then there are two probably broader use cases, which is an example of this horizontal effect that I mentioned. One is around what we call human capital management, and that's really dealing with the employment life cycle. So if you're using AI to make decisions at various stages of the recruitment process all the way through to termination of someone, then that is deemed to be high risk. So if you're using it to filter CVs, there's a recognition that might lead to discriminatory practices. If you're using it to decide on promotions, on performance reviews, evaluations, if you're looking at it to make decisions on who's going to be made redundant or whatever, there's an acknowledgement that is high risk. And then finally, education and vocational training. Similarly, if it's going to be used for exams and deciding who accesses education and so on, it's deemed to be high risk. And then, as I said, there is an acknowledgement that AI is very important in products, particularly in the area of, say, safety components. So to the extent that AI is going to be used in particular products, like, as I mentioned, medical devices, infrastructure, equipment, etc., pressure equipment, there's a big list in the EU AI Act. And that's going to be deemed to be high risk as well, because clearly that can pose risks to the physical health and safety of individuals. So that's going to be considered high risk as well. There are certain obligations then if a product or if an AI system is deemed to be high risk, and they're the sorts of things you would expect. The providers, and this is an example of the providers having the main obligation. So the people creating or developing the AI, they're the ones that are going to have most control over what the AI system does and what safeguards are put into it. So there are things like having a risk management system in place, having a good data governance structure. So Noelle mentioned earlier on the risk of bias and discrimination in the outputs of AI systems. So there's an obligation on a provider to make sure that the AI system can manage data in a way that tries to minimize any bias or discrimination. There's a requirement to keep a documentation around the use of the AI system, its specifications, generating logs, automatically generated logs, and so on. Transparency is a big one. So providers need to provide a lot of information to users to basically show them how they can use AI in a responsible way. So there is an obligation on providers to have that information and to have it understandable for users so that users can use the AI in a proper way. Human oversight, again, is really, really important. So this is the idea that you're not having AI systems making automated decisions that have an effect on individuals. There's going to be this requirement of humans in the loop. That's the expression that's used, that they're sort of looking at the outputs of the AI systems. They're not relying blindly on what the AI systems are telling them, whether it be, things like employment decisions or education decisions or in the law enforcement area or whatever it might be. And then again, as Noelle mentioned, things like accuracy and security concerns, there's a requirement to make sure that they're being dealt with. And then, as I say, conformity assessment, again, this is back to the point about an AI system being looked at like a product. And if it's a high-risk AI system, then you're going to need to treat it like a product to make sure it meets certain harmonized standards and make sure that you have a mark and that is also registered in an EU database. So again, there's a bit of regulation around that. So broadly, that's how they manage the levels of risk. Below that, again, anything else is probably either low risk or no risk. So if you look at the simplest example, your Netflix, your Spotify, where they're recommending, particular shows for you to watch or playlists or so on, that's low risk. That's AI, but that's very, very low risk. There's recommendation algorithms and so on. There's no issue with that, and there aren't going to be any requirements. One interesting obligation that applies regardless of the level of risk, though, of an AI system is this, what they're calling transparency. And I suppose, ChatGPT is probably the most famous example of this, which is where if an AI system is generating content, so whether it be audio content, video, text, or whatever, it has to tell the end user that this is artificially generated, so the user is clear. And similarly, if you're interacting with AI, so for example, chatbot, it has to be made clear to the individual that it is actually AI and it's not a human. So it's really just around transparency. So that's the obligation there. Finally, then GPAI models, again, this is probably the ChatGPT example. Again, there are certain requirements around that. There's a recognition that those models can be applied across a variety of uses. And again, there's requirements around making available technical information about how they work and making sure that they don't breach intellectual property, particularly copyright and so on. At the bottom, then, this has teeth. There are fines up to 35 million euro or 7% of global annual turnover, whichever is bigger. That's for the prohibited practices. But even all those more general obligations I mentioned, they can be up to 15 million or 3%. So again, it has huge teeth. It has even more teeth than GDPR had. So again, just something to be aware of. And then finally, there are some exclusions. And again, this was as a result of the probably of the lobbying and of national state member state interests. So things like the areas of security and defense, military are excluded. If you're using AI exclusively for scientific and pre-market research and development, it's excluded. Personal use is excluded. And there are some sort of minor exemptions if AI is using a free and open license. I'll move on then. So that's sort of summarizing the Act, I suppose, at a theoretical level. But what I'd like to do now is give you some real-life examples here. So I called out a few of these, but just to show you what they mean in practice. So I'll go through each of these in turn. So if you start at the left, so I mentioned credit scoring. So again, if you're a bank or any sort of a credit, credit organization, if you're using AI to evaluate the creditworthiness of individuals, that is deemed to be high risk. And this is an example of access to essential services. So the view is that this is high risk because it might determine a person's access to financial assistance or other services like housing, utilities, and so on. So creditworthiness is a really, really important part of a person's ability to access finance and so on. So it's for that reason that it's deemed to be high risk. However, there is a recognition that AI can be used and should be used in organizations in the area of fraud detection. So if you're using it basically to detect fraud in the offering of financial services, and actually the Act goes on to say if you're using it for prudential purposes, for example, to calculate the capital requirements of a credit institution or of an insurance undertaking, that's not going to be high risk. So it's really just if it's been used to make decisions about people's access to finance, that is going to be high risk. Life and health insurance, similarly, again, access to insurance is obviously important for individuals. And if you're using AI systems to make decisions on pricing and risk assessment in the areas of life and health insurance in particular, so those are ones that have the most direct effect, I suppose, on individuals, they're going to be high risk. Couple of other examples then. So biometric identity, again, any of us who've gone through security in the airport will be familiar with this one, basically, where you're swiping your passport and then you're looking at a camera and the AI is basically making sure the two match. So that's deemed to be not high risk if it's purely used for that purpose. I mentioned biometrics as being risky in the area of law enforcement, but it is allowed in that area. And then the final example, again, which probably applies to all industries, but in financial services, it obviously also has relevance, is this idea of a chatbot being used either for internal employees or also for customers, whether it be, call centers or customer service or so on. That in and of itself isn't high risk, but as I said earlier, there's this obligation just to make clear to the end user that it is actually AI being used rather than a human, if you like, on the other side. So there are some examples. I don't know, did I see questions or not? Or
I think maybe somebody raised a hand.
Did they? Okay. Yeah. Not sure, maybe not. Well, look, I mean, we'll do questions at the end if people have any further questions. And Noelle, I might just move on then.
Yep.
Back to you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of examples of real life implementations of, responsible AI in action, and how do you actually embed it into kind of different AI applications and uses. So the first example I was going to share was actually Accenture ourselves. So as I mentioned, analytics and AI has been used for quite a while. From a local perspective, we established an analytics innovation center way back in the early 2010s. And we began our own, in Accenture, we began our own responsible AI journey in about 2016. And it really kind of focused on kind of three main steps. So the first step was actually to put some principles in place. And those principles, were there to guide the development of the responsible AI program and framework for Accenture. And the first thing that the team did was to actually anchor them back in our core values and our code of business ethics, and to anchor them back in those kind of two main areas for the organization. Then, in terms of how could those principles be put to use, practically, well, they were used then to guide the creation of a number of policies and standards, to actually help kind of put in place some guidelines and tools to actually help kind of delivery of actions. And we apply these principles both when we're developing internal AI from an internal perspective, but also we use them when we're actually embarking on projects with kind of client organizations that we work with. And one of the examples of how we try and adhere to these principles is to kind of embed them in our software development lifecycle. And I have an example of a chatbot development, which I'll talk through in a couple of minutes, which hopefully kind of shows at a practical level kind of how some of these principles can be put in place. But the second step then was to, once we had the principles, policies, standards, etc., was actually to build a compliance program to make sure they were being adhered to. And the first thing to note, I guess, about the compliance program was that it had very senior sponsorship. So it's sponsored by our global CEO, Julie Sweet. And if you look at the steering committee that's guiding that, it has very senior people in the organization as part of that committee. So say, for example, our chief technology officer, our chief operating officer, etc. And really the compliance program consists of, kind of a process with four main parts to it. So first is that screening. So every single, application, that we're developing, the first question that's asked is that whether there is AI as part of that application. And if there is deemed to be AI present, the next question, linked very closely to kind of Brian's slides above, is, the question is, are there risks associated with that? Is it high risk or low risk? And then I guess based on the risk, there's a very detailed assessment that takes place in terms of what exactly are the risks. And then finally, what are the recommendations in terms of, mitigations against the risks throughout the development of the application. And one example is from a research and development perspective. These controls are built into our R&D approval process, for example, so that any new asset built is built, with the responsible AI by design approach. And personally, I've been through this process, kind of a number of times, through the various projects and applications that I've been involved in. So quite familiar with it at this stage. And then the final step of the three-step process was really making sure we built the capabilities within the organization to support the responsible AI compliance program. So when I say capabilities, I guess what I'm talking about is both tools. So we have a number of tools available to help us, say, for example, quantitatively assess, kind of the risk of kind of, say, for example, bias in a model. But also capability development in terms of, kind of training, education, etc. And there are a number of both mandatory and non-mandatory responsible AI courses available globally. And there has been a global responsible AI training program undertaken across the firm. And another personal example from a kind of training and knowledge development perspective is I recently had to complete a responsible AI refresher course in order to retain access to an AI tool that I had access to and that I was using as part of my day-to-day work. And if I failed to complete that responsible AI and failed to complete and pass the responsible AI training, I was at risk of actually losing access to the tool and having it revoked. So that's just a real life example of, I guess, kind of some of those capability actions. I'll move on now just in terms of, this is a slightly lower level and I suppose more technically focused example. But this is an example of how responsible AI was embedded throughout the life cycle of the development of generative AI. So, using large language models and OpenAI, those type of things, a chatbot. So this was a global client where they have a youth-focused part of their business. So their cohort of customers really value being able to engage with the organization digitally. So they know from feedback from their customers that the customers don't want to actually physically ring up, a call center, etc. They want to be able to engage, kind of with chatbots and with other kind of virtual assistants and digital channels. And so the company did have a chatbot, and they had there was approaching 1 million kind of interactions per annum with this chatbot. But actually their challenge was that although they had the chatbot and it was being used, the customer feedback from the chatbot was not good. And what this led to was, it actually led to calls into the call center as a result of the escalation, because the customers couldn't resolve their issue and just using the chatbot alone. So the company saw a real chance and opportunity to actually see, could generative AI and large language models actually help improve the customer experience with their chatbot? And we mentioned earlier, kind of internally facing and externally facing applications. So obviously this was an external customer facing application. So, the company was very, very aware of, the risks and, kind of potentially the reputational risks associated with that. But one of the things they did to mitigate that was to really adopt an approach to really embed responsible AI by design throughout the development, testing and deployment of this application. So some of the ways that they did that was, first of all, they developed, quite a lot of complex logic and code in order to really understand when customers were interacting with the chatbot, identification of intent. So say, for example, they were able to identify if a customer had malintent, and they were able to, if the customer was trying to take the chatbot off course, and get it to answer things that it shouldn't be answering, and kind of moved outside its guardrails. So there was a lot of work and a lot of layers, I suppose, of protection to do that. There was also, we spoke about, I suppose, kind of data and data privacy earlier. There was a lot of work done to embed, controls around ensuring we guided customers to make sure that they didn't input personal data. And if there was some personally identifiable data entered, kind of codes and actions to actually deal with that, and say, for example, scrub that information so that it wouldn't be retained. There was also extensive, kind of logic and language processing to assess the tone and the language, etc., that was coming, both input from customers, but also from the responses that were being generated by the language model, to make sure that protected against any toxic or harmful kind of tones or speech. In terms of testing prior to kind of the deployment and the release of the chatbot, there was very extensive testing that was executed, again with the responsible AI kind of approach in mind. So again, we mentioned earlier about kind of accuracy of information and kind of the kind of non-accuracy, inaccuracy being kind of a key risk. So there was extensive testing carried out, analysing the responses of the chatbot to assess them for accuracy, for relevance to the question, etc., etc. The team also, tested the interactions using what we call red team testing. So that's where some of the customer agent team, plus also the generative AI engineers, they were deliberately trying to get the bot to circumvent and move outside its guardrails. So they essentially did a large number of tests, trying to actually, if you like, break the bot and to try and get the bot to move outside its responsible AI guardrails, and to make sure that if somebody was trying to get it to circumvent the controls, that they knew how to stop that. And then finally, in addition to, I suppose, kind of the technical design, in addition to kind of the extensive testing that was completed, the team also put in place kind of a lot of processes so that post launch, from a responsible AI perspective, there could be continued monitoring. So, they put in place kind of monitoring of responses. They put in place alerts, if there was anything that kind of breached any, I suppose, thresholds or rules, that would alert. And they also put in place a number of processes so that if anything, kind of adverse was to happen, there was a process in place to know exactly how that would be dealt with. Say, for example, like if it meant kind of taking the bot offline for a period of time, there was kind of very defined processes to ensure that could happen in a kind of safe and controlled way. So that's just an example, I suppose, from quite a technical perspective of how you can build responsible AI, into the end-to-end delivery process. And then the final example was some work that, again, it was our team both in the dock in Dublin and also in other locations in Accenture, that we did with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, where the Monetary Authority had recognised that with AI, there were risks, particularly in financial services, and they were particularly concerned about a risk which Brian mentioned earlier, which is in the area of risk of bias against certain cohorts of customers, and then against in certain situations. So as Brian mentioned, for example, if somebody was trying to get access to, for example, some credit, then kind of if there was AI involved in some of the processes around that there could be a risk of bias if models, etc., were being used. So to mitigate that, Accenture was part of a consortium that actually worked with the authority to develop an approach to assess AI solutions, but very particularly against that risk of bias. And they were assessing to make sure the fairness, ethics, accountability, and transparency, were all considered for any AI application that was being proposed. And this application, it's very much a technology, kind of based solution, and it focuses on a quantitative assessment of the potential responsible AI risk associated with the application that's being looked at. and they actually quantify the risk based on for the particular application based on the analysis against the various dimensions. And I suppose kind of one of the really kind of beneficial things about this project is that the work has been made available through open source code and also through a number of kind of methodology papers published, etc., so that actually the benefits can be achieved at an industry-wide level. And then I think, Brian, you were just going to cover a couple of ideas in terms of kind of tangible actions that can be considered now.
Yeah. And look, I won't dwell on this, but just, I mean, based on what you've heard, obviously, so AI is here, it's here to stay, great potential, great risk. It's now regulated, certainly in the EU as well as elsewhere. So the sorts of things that we've done to ourselves, if you like, and we're recommending that any organization do, whatever stage they're at on their AI journey, are here on the slide. So see what regulation affects you. I mean, clearly the EU AI Act will. There's horizontal legislation like GDPR. There's also going to be industry-specific regulations, like for example DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act coming in January next. That and it's really working out just how do these all interlock, these various pieces of legislation. Look at if you're in multiple jurisdictions, look at that, and then just any other standards, for example, things like NIST or ISO that may be relevant as well. So really try and understand the environment, the regulatory and the compliance environment in which you're operating. Do an audit, do an inventory, to see how AI is being used across your organization now, because whether it's sort of at an enterprise level or whether it's employees using ChatGPT, using Microsoft Copilot, whatever it might be, just see what AI is being used across your organization, see how they're being used. So back to these use cases that I mentioned. And once you have a sense of that, then you can do this risk assessment that I mentioned to see, are they high risk, are they low risk, are they prohibited? Hopefully there won't be prohibited uses, but that's worth checking out as well. If they're not high risk, then there's very minimal obligations. If they are high risk, then there's going to be obligations, as I mentioned earlier. And then putting a structure around this, I suppose, a framework or a governance framework, a compliance framework around it, which allows you come up with some principles perhaps that you want to follow whenever AI is being purchased or developed or used in your organization. You might have a policy, you'll have a process for screening, perhaps new uses of AI, the way Noelle was describing. So establishing the level of risk, establishing, ongoing monitoring and so on. And then set up some tooling and some testing just to see over the life cycle of these AI systems, particularly ones that will continue to develop and evolve. For example, ones that are using generative AI and self-learning and so on. So just have something in place to keep an eye on them as they go through the life cycle in case something changes and you need to review. And then, as I say, continuous monitoring. And just across all of this overarching, and this is very, very important. Bring your workforce with you. I mean, they're the ones that are going to be using AI systems. They're the ones that need to be trained on this and communicated with. There is genuine and legitimate concern out there in some instances about what is this going to mean for individuals' jobs and their roles and so on, because there will be disruption, to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the particular work they're doing, but there will be disruption. So, communicate with your workforce, explain what's being done, train them, communicate with them and so on. And then also, in terms of the responsible AI, just be aware of things like the data aspects, the confidentiality and security aspects of this, and even things like sustainability. So, these models use a huge amount of compute power and so on. So just be aware of that in terms of choosing, everything from choosing the AI systems you use all the way to the prompts that are being used to with these AI systems. So it can all make a difference in terms of sustainability. So that's just really we tried to cover an awful lot in a short time. So I hope that was of some interest and some relevance to people. And I think, Joyce, we've time for a few questions.
Yes, yeah, no, thank you so much, Brian and Noelle. Excellent presentation, so clear. But we'll go immediately to the questions. Given the predictive policing will be banned under the EU AI Act from February, is that style of policing legal right now? That's a very specific question.
Arguably not. But I think what this is trying to do, it's trying to overlay, because you're right, there's fair process, there's due process in criminal proceedings, obviously. But what this is trying to do is regulate the use of technology in that process, I suppose. So, you know, as long as you have your risk assessment, as long as you have your human oversight. In some instances, for example, even you need to go to a court basically to be allowed to do real-time remote biometric identification. So, for example, you know, think of riots and so on, you know, and you want to do real-time, you have to go to court to be allowed to do that. So I think it's going to be an overlay, and it's going to focus on the technology. I think you're absolutely right. The process will still require fairness, but this is just supplementing it, I would have thought.
Yeah. And I know Rachel, I think, put up her hand during her presentation. She asked the question, where does the creation of a large learning model fall if you create it within OpenAI?
So there are provisions in the EOA Act, and it was interesting. There was nothing in the EOA Act about GPAI models until ChatGPT came out, and they had to go back to the drawing board and create a whole different section about GPAI models. There are certain obligations on the provider of GPAI models, and particularly those which have what they call systemic risk, which is they have huge compute power. And GPT-4 is a very good example of that. There are obligations around providing information on how they're created and how they're used, making sure that they meet IP law, for example, copyright, doing things like model evaluation and the adversarial testing that Noelle mentioned. So there absolutely are obligations when it comes to that side of things as well under the Act, absolutely.
And the question, which I think you emphasised, both of you did very well and gave examples of it, does the AI literacy obligation apply to all risk levels of AI, from no, low to medium to high?
It does, and it also applies to providers and deployers. So wherever you are in that supply chain, that AI literacy requirement is there. Now, it's an example of where the Act is delightfully vague. It says you have to have a sufficient level of AI literacy. Now, if you're a developer of an AI system, that's presumably going to be a different level of literacy.
Technical, yeah.
But yes, it's going to apply to everyone, every organization, and everyone within the organization to the extent necessary.
Then we have in business, if AI is used in the processing of customer complaints, presume this would be considered high risk, and those requirements listed would be on the slide would apply. Which requirements on your slide would apply? Especially human oversight.
Yeah, well, if it is high risk, and again, this is a case by case analysis that needs to be done, and it's really, as I said, around if it's affecting the fundamental rights of an individual. So if there are customer complaints, and if this is going to be involved in making decisions around things like credit rating, access to finance, insurance, and so on, it is high risk. In that case, there are obligations on the provider primarily, but also on the deployer in terms of things like human oversight and following instructions of the provider, keeping records of the use of the AI system and so on. So those are the sorts of practical examples that will be needed.
Yeah. Well, listen, time has caught up on us, and it was an absolutely excellent presentation. So clearly presented and gave a great overview of where we are and indeed where we're going. But I think your messages came across very clearly. As you said, keep humans in the loop, build capacities, build capabilities at different levels through education and training. And I think it's really important to think you just don't do a course once, or you know how to use a tool once, that's constantly monitored. And I think your example showed that it is very technical, very simple at another level, but that requires, and I think you've emphasized it a lot, Brian, documentation, setting up systems, monitoring, auditing. And in a way, I'm not an accountant by background, but in a way, accountancy has all those systems, policies, everything in relation. We now have to build those and embed them. And I think the value of your presentation was really high, because you emphasized so clearly that all of these things need to be embedded in an organization, and that you bring your workforce with you, and it's little by little building that capacity. So thank you very much, both of you, for that presentation. It was, as I said, really excellent and so clear. I'd like to thank also the IOB team for setting it all up and being with us today. And to you, our attendees, thank you for coming and for your questions. We were delighted to have you with us today. And next week, we have our last AI Impact Series webinar on AI and ethics, and that comes very much on some of the points that have been built over the series, and particularly what Noelle and Brian were saying. We have that with Dr. Alessandra Salsa, and she'll be here at the same time and the same place. So thank you very much again, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. And special thanks to you, Brian and Noelle. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.